My baby dolls, we're back again with another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and we're talking a little baseball today. We're talking about big bad Burleigh Grimes, baseball's last legal spitballer. And it's a great book. I tell you, it was published a few years ago. We have author Joe Niese on today, and we're going to be talking about the life and career of Burleigh Grimes. And, of course, many of you, like I mentioned in the title, know he was the last legal spitballer in the league. And we'll get into why he was grandfathered in. And, of course, what this amazing book brings out is there's just so much more to Burleigh Grimes than just a spitball. He lasted probably more into the live era of baseball than he did the dead ball era. But we're going to see the shift. We're going to see his personality. We're also going to see about 5 lives. I guess, Burleigh just had a penchant for masochism. But whatever the case is, we're going to talk about his upbringing in Wisconsin, his rough and tumble lifestyle as a ball player and a manager. It's going to be a heck of a show. Of course, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, who run by our fearless leader, Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man, and plenty of programming is going on. We got my show, Genesis, which has returned to the network after their summer break. As most of you know, I have twin boys, age 9, and so summer vacation took a backseat to doing shows, and I did a few shows during the summer, not much. But we're back, and we're back with a bang. We've already had on, they wore pinstripes and Yankees, so we began the season with a bang with the Yankee-Red Sox rivalry, and now we're doing Burleigh Grimes. And who was Burleigh Grimes? Burleigh Grimes played in baseball for about 19 years. Again, he was a spitballer. He always wore a 5 o'clock shadow. And we're going to do that. We're going to learn. He did that on purpose. And for nearly 2 decades, he brought his disposition. And boy, did he have a disposition. You wouldn't want to mess with him when he throws at your head. We tend to think of Bob Gibson or Don Drysdale throwing at people, but Burleigh was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to face on the mound. He's just that prolific. And he was tough as nails. He could mess around with anyone. He would never back down from a fight. And the book, of course, is authored by Joe Niese, and he's a librarian, a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, otherwise known as SABR. And he lives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. So, hey, we got somebody from the Dairy State. And, it's going to be awesome to just sit and talk about Burleigh Grimes. And without any further ado, please welcome Joe Niese. Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Ian, for having me. Appreciate it.
Why Burleigh Grimes out of anyone? What made you so interested in this person?
Well, it seems like I've kind of focused on people from my neck of the woods. I grew up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I was actually born in Guilderland outside Albany, New York, and moved out to Wisconsin about age 9 and lived in Eau Claire in the Chippewa Valley since then. And I seem to focus on players that from western Wisconsin, and Grimes got his start playing for a team in Eau Claire where I grew up. And it kind of went from there. I was going to do a longer article on him, and the more I researched, the more I'm like, why isn't there a book about Burleigh? And so kind of went from there.
That's fascinating. Now, let me ask you something. Wisconsin, it's one of those states that always fascinate me. I'm dying to see what Milwaukee looks like in Miller Park, and I got to get up to Green Bay and see Lambeau Field and stuff. I feel I'm missing something. But, Burleigh was born in Pennsylvania, and, his father Elias went out to Wisconsin, probably because of the lumber trade. How was Burleigh's upbringing up then, back in the 1890s, for God's sakes?
Yeah, born in 1893, and you're right, it was in the thick of the lumber era of Wisconsin. And so his father was a farmer. They moved around western Wisconsin, St. Croix County, and finally moved into Polk County when Burleigh was a child. And that was his stable upbringing was there. And baseball was always at the center of his childhood. His father was the manager of the town ball team. as far as work goes, Burleigh actually worked as a lumberjack from his teenage years on. He dropped out of high school as a sophomore because the commute was too long to go to a high school. And so that was kind of where his childhood starts there.
And you know something? Let's talk about the whole log jam thing that literally fell on Burleigh.
Yes, yeah. It was after his first year of minor league ball, he came back from Chattanooga and was still working. You know, obviously, you know, there was no off season for ball players then. They had to have jobs, and Burleigh had worked as a lumberjack for years, and so he just went back to that in the off season and almost lost his life. He was driving a team of horses down a hill, and they hit a stump that was covered in snow, and that load of logs came barreling down at him, and he hopped off his sleigh and was able to hide in front of it. But the logs did end up breaking his left non-throwing arm, which kind of hindered him for the next season.
You know, what kind of town was Clear Lake, Wisconsin, when Burleigh grew up?
It was, you know, I don't think it's changed that much. There was a railroad that went through there. You know, I think there's maybe 1,500 to 3,000 people there. That's the population now. I've gone up there several times over the years to talk with a man who was good friends with Burleigh, still around. Chuck Clark was kind of the son that Burleigh never had, and so he was instrumental in writing this book as well.
Oh, fantastic. Now, how long did it take you to research this book?
A couple years, 2 years, and then writing it took about a year once you get all your puzzle pieces on the table there and start putting them together. So about 3 years total from start to finish.
Now, let me ask you something. Did you do most of your research on the Internet, or do you have to travel, go to, like, libraries and stuff? Did you go to the Burleigh Grimes? Don't they have a thing in the museum with his...
Yes, yep. There's the Clear Lake Museum. Has a room dedicated to Burleigh. $1 million memorabilia collection. I'm not exaggerating there when I say that. It's a really awesome place. And so that I took several trips up there to get those kind of one-of-a-kind stories from Chuck. But I did a lot of research in the library. I'm fortunate as a librarian to know where to look and not to be shy to order stuff. And so I did slog through dozens of microfilm reels. And this was about 2011, 2012, as digitization was just, you know, really taking off. And so in my second book, I did a lot of database research on, you know, digitized newspapers. But the Grimes book, I did a lot of slogging through microfilm, which I feel is a lot more rewarding than just sitting in front of a computer.
Yeah, you know, you go there and you take a look at all of it. Now everything is just digitalized. The research has become so easily. Like I told you in the beginning, I think that I'm doing a book on the Ty Cobb and speaker affair. I just call up Notre Dame and they just gave me the digitalized, unedited tapes of Smokey Joe Wood that was never published in Lawrence Ritter's. They played in I forgot the name of the book. They played in their glory or something like that. And the Cleveland Museum sent me an archive, and not only that, but they also sent me transcripts right through the email. I said, look, I can't drive on. You know, for God's sakes, I was crippled for the last few years, and so they were nice enough. To do so. And I'm finding, the internet now is just loaded with stuff that, they have all I need for the research. And, no one's alive to tell me any different from what I'm writing. So it's about 90 years ago. So, I get to do it through primary sources and papers. And it's taken a while, but I think it'll be done. But anyway, Burleigh was 13 years old. Where did he go to find baseball, and what happened?
Well, after he dropped out of high school, his dad recruited him for the town ball team, Clear Lake, and he actually started that very first game against the rival town, and he got knocked out of the box pretty quickly. And so the people who backed the team often had ringers come in from Minneapolis, St. Paul, the city's area, to come pitch, and they kind of confronted Nick Grimes after this. Why are you throwing your teenage son against their biggest rival? And so after that, Nick never pitched Burleigh at home. He only pitched him on the road, kind of despite those people that called him on starting his son. And so he pitched for the town ball team up until the early teens, and then traveled down to Eau Claire, where I'm from, and didn't make the team initially, but ended up through circumstances making the team, and then the league folded, and he had to go to Minnesota and play the rest of that year. But after that, it kind of took off to the formal minor leagues.
Let me ask you this. Back in the time, like around, Burleigh, didn't he see Minneapolis pitcher Hank Aaron and how he used a spitball, and that's how he got the idea to be a pitcher?
Yes, yeah, he happened to him and his uncle traveled over there for some business, and they caught a Saints game, and like I said, Gary was throwing a spitball. Burleigh had never seen that before, became entranced with it, came back to Clear Lake and started trying to throw it, and that became his pitch moving forward.
Now, let me ask you about this. In that whole area in Wisconsin, as many of the Midwestern states, and of course on the East Coast, you had these town ball teams that played against one another. How were the rivalries back then when Burleigh was coming up?
They're very heated. They were you'd get thousands of people at these games. It's a tradition that continues till today. It's town ball teams are, you don't get the big crowds you did before, but it's still a big part of summers in Wisconsin.
And then back then you had the Class D Minnesota-Wisconsin League. And
yes.
You mentioned it folded. How prolific was that in getting people started to at least advance into the minor leagues? There was no minor leagues, but at least property of
yes.
major league teams.
Yeah, it was a stepping board for players. Rather than be back home working on the farm, a lot of these guys took their chance at trying to play in these, as you said, minor league ball teams, and it was a springboard for some players.
Now, Burleigh started the 1913 season with the, let me see if I'm saying this right, the Ottumwa, Iowa Packers of the Central Association. And how did he fare there?
He did great, and that's when he caught the eye of Chattanooga, the Chattanooga Lookouts. And so he was sent to Chattanooga, and the Tigers were actually the team that he caught the eye of. There were several teams vying for him, and they sent him to Chattanooga, and he kind of had an all right season for them. He didn't meet his first wife there, and that they got married after a few dates. But that's when he went back to Wisconsin and had that incident as a lumberjack.
And let me ask you this. With Chattanooga, he wasn't a great success, as I recall in your book.
He was not. No, he had so-so results, but that's really where his on-field demeanor took shape, was with them.
And what do you mean? And how did he get this rough, rugged style of, his demeanor through Chattanooga?
It was through his manager at that time. Up until that point, he was, I found all these references to him, being, a smiling face, always smiling when he was playing on the field, but that really changed during that 1913 season in Chattanooga. Manager at the time was Kid Elberfeld, and he really shaped how Burleigh approached the game and kind of bench jockeying and intimidation, and it was really followed Burleigh throughout his career then.
Well, let me ask you this. Why did teams in general back then loan players to like the different classes? Like now you're in the Class D Minnesota League, and now he's playing for Class A Chattanooga, but the Barons loaned him to Richmond in the Class V Virginia League. Any money passed? I mean, what was the point of that?
Boy, I can't answer that for certain. He hadn't healed yet from that broken arm, and so they just kind of said, we'll we'll loan you to this lower league for some seasoning, and it met great results in Virginia, and it was obvious that he belonged back in Birmingham.
And during the off season, though, I think he broke his leg, and he had a hard rehab throughout the winter. But he was ready to pitch in 1915.
Mm-hmm.
Fine season.
Yeah.
Why didn't the Tigers bring him up? Why did the Pittsburgh Pirates get involved?
I think if I remember correctly, there was some trade in where they purchased him, purchased his contract, and yeah, because as you've mentioned here, this was before minor league affiliations with teams, and he was going to get called up in 15, ended up getting in a fight at the end of the season with another player, but finally was called up in September of 16 by the Pirates.
And let me ask you this: when he was called up by the Pirates, and he was. This is where we're going to talk about his delivery. What the heck is chewed? He chewed slippery elm right from a tree. What the heck is that?
It's the bark of a slippery elm tree, and so it was actually had medicinal purposes for stomach ailments, and it actually had the opposite effect for Burleigh. It would give him really bad indigestion. And so he didn't chew tobacco, and so he decided to chew slippery elm to get that lubricant for a spitball.
And let me ask you this, besides the spitball, because we know that he was famous for it, but what a lot of people don't realize is he was a proponent of getting rid of it when they did decide on doing that in 1920. What other did he have in his arsenal?
He had fastball, what I've gathered, low 90s. Had a slider, which was then called a nickel curve, and a good changeup as well.
How long do you think it took Burleigh to perfect that spitball? And here's the loaded question to this one question I'm asking you. Whenever he threw the spitball, did he actually know where the hell it was going to go?
It took him years to master, and I think I don't know if he ever did. I shouldn't even say master it. He could have it one day and then completely lose it the next time he started. And so I think it was always a battle trying to have that. And what I gather, he didn't throw it as much as you would think. It was kind of the deception that he would throw it in between every pitch. He'd bring that hand up to his mouth and hide it behind the glove just to kind of get that batter wondering, is it a spitball coming this time?
And let me ask you this question. Where the heck did he hide the elm?
Well, it was like kind of like a plug of tobacco. So he'd keep that in his cheek, and for the time he would, of course at this time they threw their gloves behind the mound instead of taking it to the dugout, and he actually would throw that plug into his glove until the opposing team started to kick dirt into it, and he stopped doing that.
And let me ask you this question. Like you mentioned, it gave him indigestion, the elm. But he also had sensitive skin. That's the reason why he stopped shaving on game days.
You're exactly right.
What did the beard do to the elm? What the hell did the beard do to the elm?
It gave him, and you're exactly right. People think it was for the intimidation factor, but it was actually his skin got so irritated by it, he needed this little layer in between, the saliva and his skin, and so he thought having a little beard would help with that, and it turned out it did.
It's almost like, hey, let's wear hair and prevent the juice from coming on my face.
Yeah, exactly. It was, in the era when there was clean shaven, everyone was for the most part clean shaven. To have this guy that was kind of the bad guy in the field and throw a beard on him as well, and for intimidation, I guess. I don't know.
And you know what's interesting? This is great. You know what's interesting about the beard, which again for intimidation, but that elm that he chewed on made his teeth yellow.
Yep.
And whenever he snarled and he had that beard and he had the yellow teeth, he looked even more menacing with that yellow teeth. He did throw at batters' heads. Why would he throw at batters' heads?
Well, I think it's something that has, really hasn't changed that much, over the years. That you're still, that part of the plate is mine. You know, if someone got several hits out of him, he'd dust them off, and I think it was just, you know, that part of the plate is mine, and you're not going to take it.
You know, was the brushback an important part of his arsenal? That's the big question here.
I think so. It was, yes. It was a big part of his on-field persona of intimidation, and that included the occasional chin strap there.
Now, let me ask you, the first 2 years on Pittsburgh, how was that like for Burleigh?
Well, that first, the September, October of 16 went real well, and so they went into the 17 season thinking that Burleigh was going to be a mainstay in the rotation, and he ended up losing 13 games in a row. And so, you know, at the end of that season, the owner, Barney Dreyfuss, called him into his office and started talking to him that, hey, we're going to do away with the spitball. I'm making some steps to do away with trick pitches, including the spitball, and I think you should go to the minor leagues and work on another pitch. And Burleigh refused, and that's when he got traded to Brooklyn.
Let me ask you, how was his relationship with Honus Wagner? You know, when he was on Pittsburgh.
It seems pretty good. In the book I mentioned that in the 15-16 season, they're in spring training together in Hot Springs, I think, and Wagner sees Grimes throwing and actually says something to Dreyfuss about, hey, we need to hold on to this kid.
Now there was. You know, there was something that Grimes complained about his feet being too big. I think there was an incident where the ball bounced off Wagner's foot and into it. And what the heck was that about?
I think it was just ribbing. You know, Wagner was known for his large hands and large feet, and I think I think Grimes was just giving him a hard time about that.
I'm sitting there reading it. I'm like, man, you know, this is great stuff. I mean, this is well researched. Now, let me ask you something. There are so many myths and so many different tales about Burleigh Grimes. Let's focus on some of the myths about Burleigh Grimes that maybe aren't true.
Sure. You know, a lot. We've mentioned a little bit, kind of that. You know, the beard and intimidation, that's one of the bigger myths. Probably another one is, and you know, you mentioned at the intro there, the 5 wives. That's another one that's kind of the salacious part of his life, but it's not as bad as it sounds, if that's a bad thing. He was, you know, married his first wife after a few dates. They were divorced. He divorced his first 2 wives. His third and fourth wives passed away while they were married, and then his 5th wife outlived him. So, not as salacious as it sounds.
Yeah, I know. I think he had 2 wives who died, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Third and fourth.
Yep.
Why? My question is, why go back? I have no idea. I've been married now. Years. I'm not even going into number 2 ever. So you're talking about this big woodsman from Wisconsin who had logs falling on him, and is probably the most intimidating pitcher in the league, marrying 5 times. But I do recall in your book with the first divorce, it was messy. You know, the accusations were thrown at each other and stuff like that. You know, he cheated on her. She didn't like staying up. I think there was even a commercial or something, an ad, where I see one of his wives in the ad.
You're exactly right. Yep. Yeah, it was a tell-all of the court proceedings that was published all over the country. It was a big, like, full page ad with illustrations and stuff. So yeah, it was pretty messy.
Now let me ask you this question. We have an incident now. You had, they're on a train. He's on Pittsburgh, and you had Bezdek, who was the manager of Pittsburgh, and Grimes got into a scuffle. What's going on here?
So that's, you know, I mentioned he lost 13 games in a row, and it was a horrible season for Pittsburgh. They went through 3 managers, and Hugo Bezdek was this big hulking football player from the University of Chicago, played for for Alonzo Stagg there. And he walks into the cart, and there's Grimes and a few of the other players barking about stuff. And Bedzak calls Grimes out, and Grimes doesn't back down and starts questioning why he hasn't been pitching, even though he's lost 13 games in a row. And Bedzak punches him in the chin, and Grimes absorbs that blow and goes right at Bedzak and almost bites off his finger. And it's just one of the early, really intense fights that have been recorded as far as baseball goes.
Let me ask you this question. Besides his 13-game losing streak and the scuffle with Bedzak, was this the reason why he was traded to the Dodgers?
I think it was ultimately his refusal to go to the minor leagues and learn an out pitch to get rid of his spitball.
And when he did go to the Dodgers, I think Casey Stengel was in on that trade, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
I think Burleigh was just like a throw-in. He wasn't even the main characters who were being traded.
No, Chuck Ward, I think, was the main part of that, and Grimes was kind of a throw-in, and he almost didn't make it out of spring training. He was still focusing on that spitball, and Wilbert Robinson, manager of Brooklyn then.
Uncle Robbie,
yep.
Right?
That's right, yep, and was great at reclamation, pitcher reclamation, did wonders for Rube Marquardt when he came over to Brooklyn. And he said, let's just drop the spitball for the time being and work on your other pitches, and that seemed was a saving grace and kept him on the roster.
Let me ask you this. This is an important question because when I read your book, he ended up going to the New York Giants for one season, of course, legendary manager John McGraw. But Grimes gives McGraw so much credit, saying he learned more in that 1 year under McGraw than ever did in his whole baseball career. I don't buy that. I just think he was sore at Uncle Robbie because they had that, that falling out at the end. But do you agree with that?
Ian, I've never thought about it that way, but I wonder if it was a jab at Robinson because Robinson and McGraw were teammates in Baltimore, and they had a falling out. But Robinson was actually a coach for McGraw with the Giants, and they had a falling out, and he went over to Brooklyn. And I've never thought about it that way, but it very well could have been a jab at Uncle Robbie.
Yeah, because I know the way you described it in the book, and I know Uncle Robbie, is one of the good guys in history. He was a player's manager. McGraw was just a typical New Yorker. I mean, I'm from New York. He was gruff. He played in the dead ball. He played before the dead ball era. He used to stick his leg out, hold people, gamble, bet on games, fix games. Was the most unsavory character there was, but yet he was a genius. He was a genius. Was Uncle Robbie the same kind of genius as McGraw?
Well, I think I don't think Uncle Robbie gets the credit as a player that he was, or a manager. He gets painted sometimes as kind of a buffoon, but I think he knew what he was doing, and I think you're on point there with that. It was probably a jab at Robinson that when he said that McGraw, if he had played for McGraw his whole career, he would have easily won over 300 games, and that Giants team in 27 had 8 or 9 future Hall of Famers, and they didn't win the pennant. And he really ran himself off that team by passing along a petition to his teammates that I think I should start this game, and they signed it and gave it to McGraw, and sure enough, he was gone after that season.
I'm going to give you something else to chew on here, and I want your honest opinion, because I ask anyone who has written books on the dead ball period, into the live period, how pitchers fared. And now look, for those who don't know, and most of my listeners do know, because I always enforce the notion that, look, in the dead ball period, you had 1 or 2 balls throughout the whole game. That ball wasn't pearly white when it started. By the time the 9th inning came around, that thing was a head of cabbage with the leaves falling off of it, for God's sake. All right? I mean, let's face it. I mean, you hit a foul ball. You got to come back on the field. There was no souvenirs. That ball was rubbed on, stepped on, juiced on. It's just the seams were coming out of it. Now, the reasons why, of course, we know they changed it in 1920 was pretty much the death of Chapman, Ray Chapman, from Carl May's throwing. And again, you can't see a ball that looks dark, and they didn't have lights at night, so you can't see a ball that's coming 100 miles at you. There's a good chance you're going to die if it hits you.
Yeah.
How did Burleigh Grimes, roll with this from becoming a dead ball pitcher to now using a different type of ball?
That's one of the questions I get asked. Do I think he's a Hall of Famer? And I think he definitely is. I mean, longevity helped, but also his transition from dead ball to live ball went very well. And he led the entire major leagues in the whole decade of the 20s, that first live ball era, in several different categories. And I think that's kind of solidifies his place as a Hall of Famer.
Let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask, because you guys do a great job of research. I've researched it up and down, left and right, sideways, diagonal, no matter how many times. Is there any difference in the ball that was used in the dead ball era as there was in the live ball era?
It's really started, if I remember correctly, it started to take off there in the 20s as Ruth started to hit those home runs. That they changed, the ball became a little tighter there, and balls started to fly out of the park. And as you said, that they were using that one or two balls a game. They'd go into the stands to retrieve it, and during that dead ball era. So, like you said, it was mush by the end of the game. Where in the 20s and early 20s, when they started to use a bunch of balls, that those balls were fresh and wound tight and ready to go out of the park.
Let me ask you this: World War I. Burleigh went into the Navy. I think him and Rube McCord went into the Navy. How was that for him?
Well, that was they ended up signing up for the Navy Reserves, and so they didn't see any action. There was many players that went overseas, but Burleigh was just in the reserves in a post in Chicago.
Yeah, and then when he came out of the Navy, and I always love Frankie Frisch. What's going on here? What's this gripe about?
Well, if I remember correctly, Frisch hit one through the box at him, and so Grimes on a play at first base, they got close, and he nearly severed Burleigh's Achilles tendon, and so that ended his 1919 season pretty darn quickly.
Let me ask you this question. When Burleigh ended up going to the Cardinals, was Frankie Frisch no, I think Joe McCarthy was the manager when he went to the Cardinals.
Gabby Street was
Gabby Street, yeah.
Yeah,
Frisch would be known as the manager of the Gas House Gang in '34.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, he would do that. Let me ask you this question. Why, and we spoke so much about it already, why does the committee of the major leagues want to outlaw the spitter?
So, and before the 1920 season, the owners, Barney Dreyfuss, the Pittsburgh owner that I mentioned earlier, finally got his wish to do away with trick pitches, and spitball was lumped into that. At the time, it was actually prior to the 20 season when they started thinking that we need to use more balls. And so up until this point, like you said, they're using one or two balls. They were using anything they could to scuff it up, to darken the ball, from coffee to tobacco juice. And so the spitball got lumped into that. And so they said, okay, spitballers, the 1920 season, this is your last year to throw it. After that, no more. And so they went through the whole 20 season, and Brooklyn and Cleveland ended up going to the World Series, and Burleigh is the best pitcher for Brooklyn. Stan Kovaleski is the best pitcher for the Indians, and they're both spitball pitchers. And so the spitball kind of takes center stage of that 1920 World Series, and the owners see this, and so they step back and say, oh, okay, team owners of teams, you can if you want, allot 2 pitchers from your roster to throw the spitball for the rest of their career. Some teams didn't. Pittsburgh didn't allot anyone. Burleigh was one of 2 players for Brooklyn, and he was the last pitcher to throw that. In 1934, he was the last remaining pitcher of those 20 that were spitballers.
And let me ask you this question. Cleveland ended up winning, the World Series in 1920. Were they called the Dodgers by then, and they were still the Brooklyn Robins? I forget.
They were the Brooklyn, their official name was the Brooklyn Superbas, and then in the nod to Wilbur Robinson, they were the Robins then, Brooklyn Robins.
Yeah, because I'm from Brooklyn, and my family still lives back in Brooklyn. I've seen Abbott's Field, just a wall. Of course, they left before I was born, but the Dodgers is still talked about in Brooklyn. Let me ask you this question, very important. As this was going on with the whole debate with the spitball and to do away with it, we had 2 other instances here. One is that the Black Sox scandal, erupted right before the World Series that summer, and all these guys were put on trial, of course exonerated, and then brand new commissioner, Landis, throws them out a ball. But also, years later, Smokey Joe Wood, in his interviews with Larry Ritter and later on Murdoch, who wrote the biography of Van Johnson, said there was betting going around in the 1920 series. Did you come across any information indicating it?
I didn't really, and it wouldn't surprise me if it would though. But if I remember correctly, Rue Marquardt was busted for trying to scalp tickets, and all that stuff was going on with the Black Sox, and they hopped on that right away for him just scalping tickets. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there was betting going on then. I think it went on for years. I don't think it would just go ahead.
When I listened to the Ritter tapes, and of course it was unedited. This is the stuff that was never released in the glory of their times later on. He indicated, Smokey Joe Wood, that they bet on themselves. And what that does is 2 things. One is they're betting to win. Okay? Yeah. They're not betting for the Dodgers, and then they're going to throw a game. Okay? And number 2, because they bet on themselves, they would be exonerated because there's no fix. You see, the difference between the 1920 series and the 1919 series was the Sox took a fall. They bet against themselves. The Indians bet on themselves. And in Smokey Joe's mind, in his own testimony, you got to give credit to it. Credence is 40 years later. He said, the sport was full of dirt, but we would never have bet against ourselves. Never, 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 he said, just like that. And it's interesting because the whole era, especially with Grimes and all this stuff, players would lay down at the end of the season to give more competitive teams who need to finish in first, second, or third to get monetary awards. So, if you win the pennant, you get an X amount of dollars, and you finish second, and third, you get X amount of dollars. Did Burleigh Grimes, did you come across anything in your research that Burleigh Grimes, when the Dodgers were out of it, just laid down and, just gave up stuff?
I never came across anything with Burleigh. He was kind of a one-man team a lot of times in his later time with Brooklyn, where he didn't get along with anyone. And so I think it was always he was going to do this for himself a lot of times. And so I don't know if you really had any thoughts about helping out other teams.
Because, in the research I did, it says everyone did it, and we don't know. I'd have to go back and research it. But I did ask Hank Thomas, the grandson of Walter Johnson. I said, I've done a lot of research, and I have his book. It was written 20 years ago. He wrote the biography of his grandfather, and he did it in a very impartial way. I said, let me ask you something. On the show twice. Did Walter Johnson lay down because the Senators were? I said, absolutely. He did. And in fact, in one season, I think it was 1913, he gave up a hit. I think his ERA was 1.13, and it was broken in 1968 by Bob Gibson, who had a 1.12 ERA, and if he didn't lay down, he would still hold the record of having the lowest ERA ever. But he was, Sam Crawford under Detroit. They were friends, and he gave up. So it would be an interesting thing to see if Burleigh Grimes, who is such a fierce competitor, actually went along and got some extra loot in a time period when these guys were getting paid nothing and were being nickeled and dimed by the management.
Yeah, that's good. I'm gonna have to look back at his what his August and September records were and see if there was a trend.
Because 5 years ago, if you would have asked me this question, I would have had nothing. I've done extensive research on the dead ball period, and Burleigh Grimes is one of the most fascinating characters I've come across. Do you know something? Somebody figured out the signs that he was throwing spitballs, and it happened in the old Baker Bowl in Philadelphia. Let's get going on that one.
Yes, the hat, right? Is that what you're referring to?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Art Fletcher, I think it was. Grimes, every time he would throw a spitball, and like I said, he'd bring that ball and glove up to his mouth every time. But the only time he threw spitballs, his temples would move, and thus his hat would move too. And so he needed to get a bigger hat so his temples wouldn't move every time he juiced that ball up.
How good was the eyeballs of Philadelphia Phillies to recognize that when the Dodgers didn't even recognize it? They thought the catcher, Hank DeBerry, he was giving away signals somehow that they just figured out his spitball was coming, and so they substituted veteran Zach Taylor.
Yes, yeah, that was with, when they were, and then the second baseman was killed off, I think, in the series where when Grimes was going to throw a spitball, he'd pick up a handful of dirt and throw it down, so he had a little grid on his hand in case the ball came to him.
Yeah, that's right. And you know something? The Bat Boy, of all people, solved the mystery.
Yes, yep. You're right.
The Bat, of all the people, the Bat Boy, for God's sakes. What the heck? I fired the manager right then and there that my Bat Boy knew, and you didn't even know.
Yeah, I guess you don't need the Bat Boy anymore with the Apple Watches that are coming out now, right? Is that the latest?
Oh, my God. And then, the Red Sox, after being accused of that, they said, well, the Yankees have done it also, So it wasn't the Massachusetts teams, It's like, because I live 8 minutes away from Gillette Stadium where the Patriots play, and let me tell you something. I hear already the cars on the highway going to Gillette Stadium for tonight's game when Kansas City comes. And my son, he loves football more than baseball. I'm still a baseball number one kind of guy, but this guy, he's 9 years old. He just said, and we met Gronk this summer and Brady and all that. Oh my God, he was in heaven. Deflategate, Spygate, all this stuff goes to Massachusetts teams. What the heck's going on up here? I have no clue.
I don't know.
I have no clue. But, this is very interesting about Burleigh, okay? He spent 3 different stints with the Pirates. Why keep getting him back?
That second round, he pitched for them in 28 and 29, and those were really the two best years of his career. Actually, the numbers, he could have almost won 30 if he hadn't stuck his hand out and took one in the thumb on a line drive. But I don't know what it was, if they're glutton for punishment or what. But, that second stint, and he ran himself out of town again arguing about contracts. And he actually finished his career with the Pirates in 34. That was his last pitching stint was with them.
Now, he moved on to the minor leagues. He's still effective, not only as a player, but a manager for the Bloomington Bloomers of the Illinois, Indiana, Iowa League. What the heck's going on here?
He wasn't ready to give it up yet. He was actually he was looking to throw with the Cardinals again, and they said, why don't you can be the manager and play for one of our affiliates. And so he threw for them for 1 year and had some success. And that was his last year of throwing, was 35. before moving on to strictly as a manager at 36 in Louisville, and then moving on to Brooklyn as the manager for them for a couple of years.
That was after they fired Casey Stengel.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Two really pitiful years for Brooklyn there with Burleigh at the helm. Kind of the two highlights were Brooklyn's first night game, which the first one was Van Meter's second no-hitter in a row. And then Babe Ruth was his bench coach, which was a horrible experiment because Ruth wanted to be in the lineup every day.
He was totally out of shape, as you mentioned. Horrible.
Yeah.
43 at the time.
Yeah.
43, but here's some. I had Paul Dixon on my show, and he just wrote the biography of Leo DeRocha. And he said, Ruth and DeRocha, I mean, you're going back to the days of the Yankees when Ruth accused DeRocha of stealing his watch, which DeRocha fiercely denied. And now these two are pretty much coaches, besides DeRocha playing shortstop, helping out Burleigh Grimes. And all of them are fierce. How's that go?
Yeah, I don't, not very well. I don't think, when you have those two guys as your bench coaches, and it probably was no love lost between them. I'm sure it was just a disaster for Grimes. And I'm always curious, on his Hall of Fame plaque, they mentioned him managing Brooklyn those two seasons. Like, why would you waste space on a Hall of Fame plaque with those two miserable seasons?
I think Burleigh had, the best success with Brooklyn, the Dodgers. And one of the things that we cannot forget about talking about, actually two things. One is Zach Wheat. Wheat was, I think, the player who played the most with Burleigh when he pitched. How was Zach Wheat as an influence on Grimes and, of course, the Dodgers?
Grimes loved Wheat. Loved him, and actually, he's after my football book that I'm working on. Wheat is my next subject. I have a bunch of research completed on him for a book, and so Wheat was constant professional, quiet, went about his business, was the Brooklyn Robbins player. Everyone loved Wheat, and so. Just did his, there were some injuries over the years, but he played the most games behind Grimes, and when Grimes needed a key hit, Wheat was the one that often got it for him.
Then, of course, we got the great Dazzy Vance. These guys together were prolific in the 1920s. Let's talk about these two together.
Sure. Dazzler. Yep. Their best season together was 24. Of course, Vance bounced around the minor leagues until I think it was 22 when the Dodgers, he finally came to them. And 23 and 24, they were probably one of the best 1-2 pitching combinations in the league that year, and came down to the last week of the season, and the Giants beat them for the pennant. But Vance was an oddball, to say the least, but him and Grimes were really good together.
And something, you know what I mean, Grimes? Even when you are as revered as, say, Honus Wagner, even Ty Cobb said Grimes was just, to see Grimes. And he was in the American League, and Grimes was in the National League. But Rogers Hornsby, for God's sakes, it's going after one of the greatest players ever. He's having a fight with him when he was a Giants coach. Yeah,
I don't think Grimes lacked self-confidence, and I think he thought he was just as good as anyone out there. And when Hornsby was managing, and he took him out, and Grimes didn't like that too much, and Hornsby followed him into the clubhouse and emerged with a black eye. So.
Yeah, now this is very interesting. In his later years, he would name his own all-star team. And, a lot of his fellow players were on it. Dizzy Dean, Dazzy Vance, Red Buffing, Lefty Gomez. I was surprised about third base. Pie Traynor. What's going on with Pie Trainer? Why did he put Pie on third base?
Well, that was that 28 and 29 year in Pittsburgh. Him and Trainer got very close, and so that's where that comes from. Was that Trainer was the big offensive cog next to the Wayner brothers, I guess, in those seasons as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Zach Wheats in left field, and you got Ed Roosh, who was, again, one of the heroes of the 1919 Reds. Lloyd Wayner. I think he was the Little Poison, wasn't he?
No, I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah. One of them's the Big Poison, one of Earl Combs and Kiki Kyler. He only has one person in right field, and that's the Babe, who he served with as coach.
Yeah.
He got all the people he played with: Rube McCard, Al Mamak, Sherry Smith, Leon Cador, Ray Kemmer, Lehman, Wyatt Hurt, Hoyt, Dizzy Dean, Dazzy Vance, just Red Ruffing. I mean, it's just, it's just people that I wouldn't have picked. But again, he lived through the era. He lived to an old age. Why do you think it was so late? Maybe, 30 years after he ended his baseball career, did the Hall of Fame finally honor him?
Well, it was exactly 30 years. 34 was his last season, and he was inducted in 64. And so there's a couple things. One of them is Ty Cobb. When Ty Cobb was near the end of his life in the late 50s, he kind of made it his mission to reach out and get these players that he thought belonged in there into the Hall of Fame, and Grimes was one of his favorite players. Up until, those last couple of years of the 50s and 60s, he was rarely on a ballot, and, things have changed, obviously, how they go about voting that. But there was also the Veterans Committee he was voted in by, and that was kind of a complaint about that era of the 60s and 70s was the Veterans Committee when they were voting in players from their era. And so Grimes, I think he's deserving. And I guess I have some bias here, having spent so much time reading, researching and writing about him, but that's how he got in 64.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because this is comical. Well, I think one time he was going in for his fishing rod into a store, and these guys were talking about baseball. I forgot who were concerned, and they asked Grimes, and they're like, "Yep, we knew you can answer that question." And then Grimes turns and says, "You knew who threw the pitch? Why don't you explain that story?"
Yeah, he was in a fishing bait shop in Wisconsin in the late 70s. He retired to Lake Holcomb in northern Wisconsin, in my neck of the woods here. And there was one of those tearaway calendars on the wall, and it asked who gave up the first Grand Slam in World Series history. And Burleigh happened to be in the shop there, and they said, "Burleigh, do you know who gave up it asked who it was, who hit the first Grand Slam World Series history." And Burleigh knew that answer. And as he was exiting, he said, "And do you know who gave that home run up? One Burleigh Grimes," as he walked out of the shop.
Yeah. That is priceless. Now, let me ask you this question. Was there anything I didn't cover in my interview? Because, I can't cover everything that maybe you would want to say to the listeners about Burleigh.
You did a great job, Ian. You did your research, so you would get an A+ on your book report here.
Thank you, sir.
I just think it's fun to remember these players as someone who has loved baseball his whole life, and thought I knew a lot about baseball. It was really eye-opening to learn about the eras that Burleigh played in, that Grimes played in, and I think it's easy for us to, like anything in history, to forget about those that came before us, and it's fun to write a book about someone who played a big role in baseball in the teens, 20s, and 30s.
When are you going to be finished with the Zach Wheat book? A couple of years from now?
Oh, I'm finishing up. I'm in the middle of working on a book about Gus Doré, if you know that name at all. He was quarterback at Notre Dame, with Newt Rockne, and popularized the forward pass. So I got about another year on that, and then I'm going to hit Wheat up, and so I kind of have a 5-year plan for that. So. All
right. Well, we're going to I'll be here in 5 years, hopefully.
All right. I hope so, too.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to be ending the show anyway in about 2 seconds. Stay on the line. Where can we find your book besides Amazon and McFarland?
You can find it, as you said, Amazon, McFarlane. You can find it on my website, joeniese.com, JoeNiese. You can find it there, order it through PayPal, and I will send you an autographed copy, free shipping, $20.
Now let me ask you this: when this comes out, I want to go on your website, man. And this is like great stuff, you know.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
This is like great stuff. I mean, come on. You just told me a heck of a lot of Burleigh Grimes. Anyone listening to this podcast, which will probably be published next week sometime, is going to learn a lot about Burleigh Grimes. Hold the line. This is how I end the show. Folks, I had a great time here with Joe Niese. You know, we're going to get him back for Handy Andy Panko. I think that was your latest book. Burleigh was written before that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, Andy Pasco. Andy Pasco,
yeah. We're gonna get him on the show again, and fascinating research, really easy to read book, keeps you glued. Go out, get the book. Anyone who's a baseball fan should learn about the legend of Burleigh Grimes. I had a great time talking with you, sir, and just keep it cool, man. You do a great job at writing. I mean, I loved it.
Sam.
Loved every minute of it. And in the immortal words, folks, of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.